It was the kind of heat that had a weight to it in the summer of 1856 on the Fairview Plantation in Georgia, a heat that sat on your chest and made each breath a conscious labor. The air shimmered above the endless rows of sugarcane and the red earth cracked like old pottery. For the enslaved people working those fields, the heat was just another form of bondage, a relentless force that drained the strength from their bodies as surely as the overseer's whip. Near the edge of a murky stagnant pond where the mosquitoes hummed in a constant cloud, a young woman named Elsie collapsed. She had been coughing for weeks, a dry hacking rattle that had deepened into something wet and terrible. Now she lay on her side, her dress a faded rag stained with dirt and something darker. Each breath was a ragged gasp that scraped her lungs raw. She could feel the fever burning through her, a fire that made her shiver despite the sun's fury. She knew this sickness. She had seen it take others. It started with a cough and ended in a grave dug hastily beyond the quarters. Elsie was 20 years old, but her eyes held the weariness of someone twice her age. She had been born on Fairview, her mother sold away when she was 8, her father unknown, lost to the same brutal system that now claimed her life by inches. She pressed her forehead against the cool damp earth, seeking refuge. The world around her, the buzzing, the distant shouts, the rustle of cane was fading, replaced by a roaring in her ears and the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. It was here, as the darkness crept into the edges of her vision, that the mistress's buggy came down the path. Marin Whitfield, wife of the plantation owner Charles Whitfield, was returning from a pointless afternoon drive, a gesture of boredom more than leisure. Seated beside her was her younger sister Lydia, visiting from Savannah, her curiosity about plantation life not yet hardened into indifference. The buggy, pulled by a single tired horse, was driven by Isaac, an older enslaved man whose face was a mask of resigned competence. Marin spotted the figure by the pond first. Her lip curled, not in concern but in irritation. "What is that girl doing lying about in the middle of the day, Isaac? Who is that?" Isaac's hands tightened on the reins. "That's Elsie, ma'am. She's been poorly. Overseer said she couldn't work the line today." "I did not ask for the overseer's report," Marin snapped, her voice like the crack of ice. "I asked what she is doing on my ground, looking like discarded trash." She gestured with a flick of her wrist. "Stop the carriage." Isaac obeyed. The buggy halted, kicking up a small cloud of dust that settled over Elsie's still form. Lydia leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Marin, she looks dreadful." "Is she dying?" The word hung in the thick air. Marin stepped down from the buggy, her silk skirts whispering against the dry grass. She approached Elsie, her shadow falling over the girl's face. Elsie's eyes fluttered open. She saw the blurry form of her mistress, the pale face under the parasol, the expression of cold disdain. Instinct born of a lifetime of subjugation made her try to rise. Her arms trembled as she pushed against the ground. A convulsive cough racked her body and a spray of crimson flecked the dirt between her hands. She collapsed back, utterly spent. Marin watched this struggle not with pity but with a kind of clinical contempt. She shook her head slowly. "Look at her, Lydia. Absolutely useless. They grow so feeble when they decide to be ill. It is always a performance." A soft sound escaped Lydia's lips, not quite a word. Marin, however, let out a laugh. It was a light, brittle sound devoid of any warmth. It was the laugh of someone dismissing a minor inconvenience, the laugh of absolute, unquestioned power. It cut through the humid air and lodged itself in Elsie's fading consciousness sharper than any knife. Isaac stood rigid by the horse, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He dared not move, dared not speak. Inside he was screaming. Elsie felt the laugh vibrate in the air. It did not reach her ears. She had been born deaf, a fact known to all on Fairview. But she felt it through the earth, through the molecules of the air, a tremor of utter contempt. In that moment, as her life bled out into the Georgia soil, something in her spirit, a last ember of a fire she thought long extinguished, roared to life. Her grandmother's stories, tales whispered in the dark of a power that resided in the blood, in the connection to the land, in the righteous fury of the wronged. They had seemed like fantasies, shields against a cruel world. Now they felt like her only weapon. With a final desperate surge of will, Elsie rolled onto her back. She fixed her clouded eyes not on Maren but on the pitiless blue sky above. Her lips moved. At first no sound came. Then a whisper, a thread of voice woven from pain and memory. The words were not English. They were fragments of a tongue stolen and remembered, pieces of a prayer older than the plantation, older than the country itself, passed down in secret from mother to daughter. Isaac's blood ran cold. He recognized the cadence, the ancient rhythm. Maren took a half step back. What is she muttering? Make her stop. But no one could stop it. The words grew stronger, shaping themselves around Elsie's last breaths. You laugh, she whispered, her voice gaining an uncanny clarity. You laugh while my life leaves me. You laugh at my pain. So let your laughter turn to ashes in your mouth. Let your sleep be filled with the faces you never saw. Let your heart learn the weight of a tear you never shed. By my blood, by the blood of my mother and her mother before her, I bind you, Maren Whitfield. As you have given no mercy, you shall find none. You will beg for relief and it will pass you by. You will weep and your tears will be as salt in a wound. The curse settled over the scene like a sudden chill. The insects fell silent. The very light seemed to dim. Elsie's chest rose, fell and was still. Her eyes remained open, staring at the sky now empty of everything. A profound silence followed, broken only by Lydia's sharp intake of breath. Maren stood frozen for a second, then she shook her head violently as if to dispel a bad dream. Nonsense, she declared, her voice too loud. The ravings of a fevered mind. She turned on her heel, her skirts swirling. Isaac, bury that. See, it's done. And she climbed back into the buggy, her spine rigid. As Isaac was left to tend to Elsie's slight body, the buggy rolled away. But the curse did not roll away. It lingered in the soil where Elsie's blood had fallen, in the air where her last words hung. It attached itself to Maren Whitfield, a silent passenger on her journey back to the big house. The first change was subtle. That night, as Maren prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in her dressing mirror. For a fleeting instant she did not see herself but a gaunt, hollow-eyed woman with dirt on her cheeks. She blinked and the image was gone. A trick of the light, she told herself. But the unease remained. She dreamed not of Elsie but of drowning in a river of mud while voices whispered names she did not recognize. She woke gasping, her fine linen sheets damp with sweat. The next morning her prized rose bushes by the veranda were found wilted, blackened as if by frost, though the night had been warm. The cook reported that the milk had soured instantly upon being poured into her personal china cup. A portrait of Maren's own mother fell from the wall in an empty room, the glass shattering but the canvas beneath mysteriously slashed as if by a nail. Charles dismissed it all as bad luck and incompetent servants. Lydia, however, watched her sister with growing dread. Maren's confident sneer began to fray. She became jumpy, starting at sudden noises. She complained of constant fatigue and a bitter metallic taste that no amount of wine or tea could wash away. She began to see things. A shadow darting at the edge of a corridor. A figure standing in the cane fields at dusk that vanished when she looked directly at it. It was the laughter that went first. Maren found. She could not laugh. Not truly. When she tried at a neighbor's vapid joke, the sound that emerged was a harsh, choked bark that died in her throat and left her feeling empty. Then the sleep left her. Night after night she lay awake listening to the house. And the house spoke back. She heard crying. A soft muffled weeping that seemed to come from the walls, from under the floorboards. It was the sound of boundless sorrow. She would send servants searching but they found nothing. The sound would stop only to begin again the moment she was alone. Her own luxurious bedroom became a prison. The air grew perpetually cold. The scent of damp earth and sickly sweet decay seeped into the drapes, the bedding, her clothes. No perfume could mask it. She ordered the room scrubbed with lye, the walls repapered. The next day the new paper was stained with the same strange mildew-like patches that formed shapes eerily reminiscent of a hunched human figure. Lydia begged her to see a doctor. Charles scoffed, calling it female hysterics. Marin, trapped between her husband's derision and her own mounting terror, began to unravel. Her sharp tongue turned inward. She snapped at everyone, then would burst into unexplained tears. The tears were the worst part. They came uncontrollably at odd moments during meals while giving orders in the middle of the night. They were not tears of self-pity but of a profound, overwhelming grief, a sorrow that felt ancient and bottomless. She wept for losses she had not suffered, for pains she had never felt. She wept as if weeping for every single soul who had ever suffered on Fairview land. This was the curse's true work. It was not haunting her with ghosts, it was hollowing her out and filling her with the collective anguish she had spent a lifetime ignoring. One evening a week after Elsie's death, Marin stood in her parlor trying to focus on some embroidery. The weeping sound began again, this time not from the walls but from inside her own head, a cacophony of silent sobs. She clapped her hands over her ears, but it was no use. In a flash of rage and despair she seized a porcelain vase and hurled it into the fireplace. It shattered with a crash. As the fragments flew, one sharp piece spun back and cut a thin line across her cheek. She stared at the blood beading on her skin, feeling a strange relief at the simple physical pain. Then she looked at the shattered vase and saw amongst the pieces not the painted flowers but tiny reflected images of faces, dark faces, eyes filled with silent accusation. She screamed. This time Lydia came running and found her sister slumped on the floor, not fainting but weeping those deep, wrenching sobs. "Please," Lydia whispered, holding her. "What is it? What do they want?" It was Isaac who provided the answer. Summoned by Lydia, he stood in the doorway of the parlor, his hat in his hands, his gaze lowered but his voice steady. He had heard the full curse by the pond. He knew its nature. "Miss Lydia," he said softly, "it ain't about what they want. It's about what she never gave. Seeing. Acknowledging. Elsie didn't curse her to be haunted. She cursed her to feel. To feel the weight of what she's standing on." Marianne heard him. Through her tears a sliver of understanding pierced the fog of her terror. "Feel what?" she croaked. Isaac met her eyes for the first time. "The sorrow, ma'am. All of it." The next day Marin, a shell of her former self, did something unprecedented. She walked away from the big house, not toward the gardens but toward the slave quarters. She moved like a sleepwalker, her fine dress dragging in the dust. People stopped their work, watching in stunned silence. She went to the rough infirmary shed where a sick child lay burning with fever. She did not speak. She simply stood in the doorway and looked. Really looked. She saw the mother's fearful eyes, the child's labored breathing, the pile of ragged blankets. She felt a fresh wave of the curse's grief rise in her, but now it had a focus. This child's suffering was real and she was part of the system that allowed it. She did not offer help. She had no idea how. But she did not look away. She went to the fields and stood at the edge, watching the backs bent under the sun, the overseer on his horse. She saw the exhaustion, the hopelessness, the humanity. The curse within her vibrated in resonance with the scene. It was no longer just a supernatural torment, it was a brutal mirror. Finally, as the sun began to set, she asked Isaac to take her to Elsie's grave. It was an unmarked mound of red clay on a barren slope. Isaac led her there, then stepped back. Marin stood before the raw earth. The proud mistress was gone. In her place was a shattered woman, hollowed out by a grief not her own. She fell to her knees, not caring about the dirt staining her silk. She placed her hands on the grave. "I see you, Elsie," she whispered, her voice raw. "I see you now. I am sorry." The words were utterly inadequate, a pebble thrown into an ocean of wrongs. But they were the first true words of acknowledgement she had ever spoken to someone she considered property. The wind which had been still stirred the leaves in a nearby oak. The oppressive sense of being watched which had dogged her for days lessened by a fraction. The weeping in her mind softened to a whisper. The curse did not lift. Such things are not so easily undone. But it shifted. It became a burden she had to carry, not just a storm that battered her. She had acknowledged the weight. That night for the first time she slept a few hours of dreamless, exhausted sleep. The next morning Maren began to change. It was not a sudden conversion to abolitionism. Such a thing was impossible in her world. But the curse had rewired her perception. She could no longer view the enslaved people as furniture. She started small. She ordered slightly better rations for the sick. She quietly countermanded an especially brutal punishment ordered by the overseer, using her husband's irritation with her nerves as a cover. She learned the names of the children. When Charles raged about her sentimentality and weakness, she did not fight, she simply absorbed his anger and retreated, her inner world now a chaotic mix of her own fraying nerves and the echoing sorrow the curse had planted in her soul. The final breaking point came a month later. A young man named Samuel caught his arm in a sugar press. The overseer deemed it a careless injury and left him in the quarters to suffer. The man's screams of agony echoed across the property. In the past Maren would have shut her window. Now the screams felt like they were inside her own bones. The curse's grief ignited into a fury that was not her own but felt more true than any emotion she'd ever possessed. She stormed into Charles's study, her face pale, her eyes blazing with a light he had never seen. "You will send for the doctor. Now." "For the slave." Charles looked up from his ledgers astonished. "Have you lost your mind completely? He is a human being and he is in agony," Maren shouted, her voice cracking. "If he dies from your neglect, his blood will be on your hands, and I will feel every drop of it." She meant it literally. The curse had made her empathic to the point of agony. Charles saw not his wife but a wild-eyed stranger speaking a truth he could not comprehend. Perhaps fearing her madness more than the expense, he reluctantly sent for the town doctor. Samuel's arm was saved, though he would never use it properly again. That act of forced mercy broke something between Maren and Charles. It also marked a turning point in the curse's hold on her. The curse had been born from mocked suffering. It could only be tempered not by forgotten but by acknowledged suffering actively resisted. Maren would never be a hero. She remained a product of her time, trapped in a system of monstrous evil. But the woman who had laughed at a dying girl was gone. In her place was a woman haunted, burdened, her laughter silenced forever, replaced by a perpetual melancholic understanding that weighed on her like a physical yoke. She became known as the weeping mistress, a figure of pity and curiosity to her peers and of cautious, bewildered speculation among the enslaved. The curse had not brought her low with fire or phantom horrors. It had reduced her to tears, and in those tears she had found for the first time a semblance of mercy, not given but painfully wrung from her own soul. She lived out her days at Fairview, a quieter, sadder presence. The marks on her bedroom wall never faded. The scent of earth sometimes returned. And on quiet nights she would sometimes sit on her veranda looking toward the slave quarters and the unmarked graves beyond, listening not to ghosts but to the living silence heavy with stories she could now hear. Elsie's curse had not killed Maren Whitfield. It had simply made it impossible for her to ever be fully alive in her world of willful blindness again. She had been forced to see, and having seen she could never unsee. And in the brutal economy of justice sometimes that is the most profound punishment of all.